What goes up must come down. That saying wasn't technically invented for planes, but it might as well have been. Every plane that takes to the air has to come back down again eventually, but sometimes those landings are unplanned. Even when they're not, sometimes a plane lands and then the pilot walks away, never to return. There are abandoned planes all over the world, but you'll find the best of them here in this video. Let's start off with a plane that was once just another plane that crashed into the sea, but is now a popular spot for divers. This is the wreck of the Corsair in Honolulu, Hawaii. There are several other wrecks in the area that were placed deliberately to become artificial reefs. This one wasn't. The World War II plane suffered an engine failure in 1948, forcing the pilot to make a dangerous landing on water. He was rescued after spending a few hours bobbing around in the water in his life jacket. His plane wasn't so lucky. Nobody could get to it in time to prevent it from sinking, so it went down to the bottom of the ocean. It's now more than 115 feet below the waves in an area that's notorious among divers for its strong and unpredictable currents, and requires a 4-minute decompression stop to return from. We stand by our point that it's popular with divers, but any diver thinking of visiting the Corsair must have advanced skills. The difficult trip is made worth it by the sight of not only the plane, but the stingrays, jacks, and garden eels that live in and around it. A plane that's abandoned in a remote location will probably be left to rot. A plane that's been left behind somewhere that's easy to reach, though, will almost certainly find itself repeatedly targeted by vandals and graffiti artists. That's what happened to this twin turboprop Grumman G159 in Cartersville, Georgia, USA, which now boasts a psychedelic external color scheme. The plane was abandoned in mysterious circumstances by the side of a river during the early 2000s. It didn't take long for scavengers to find it, and they picked clean its instrument panels, engines, wiring, tail, and even the wings in next to no time at all. They left behind the rest of the fuselage, though, including the leather seats. The plane once belonged to Phoenix Air, which operates in the area but says that this Grumman was sold into private hands after they stopped using it, and they're not responsible for its fate. The land the plane is standing on belongs to the city of Cartersville, and so the local authorities could have it removed if they wanted to, but they've decided to let it lie and continue in its role as an unconventional tourist attraction instead. The Boeing 737 is a big plane. It's very difficult for anybody to move a plane of such size without anybody else noticing. Nevertheless, someone managed it a while ago in Kuta Selatan, Bali, Indonesia. It stood in the middle of a field in plain sight, right next to a limestone quarry. Nobody saw it land here, and based on the environment, it's doubtful that it would even be capable of landing here. But there's no sign that it was dragged here either. The busy Pandawa beach is visible from here, and yet nobody on the beach noticed a huge plane arriving in a place where a plane obviously isn't supposed to go. To make things even stranger, the plane has been stripped of all its identifying insignia and livery. It's almost like someone designed it to be a mystery on purpose. Some locals say that it was supposed to become a restaurant for the tourists who visit the beach, but the would-be owner ran out of cash before they could get the job done. But there's no official record of that. What more could an old plane hope for than to be retired to a Hall of Fame when its flying career is over? That honor isn't extended to the overwhelming majority of aircraft, but you'll find plenty of them at the Vail Planes of Fame Air Museum in Vail, Arizona, USA. The Planes of Fame Museum, which might be more accurately described as a boneyard, was put together by aviation enthusiast Ed Maloney in 1957 as his way of preserving and honoring the aviation industry. While there are quite a few broken down wrecks at the site, there are also several fully restored vintage planes, some of which date back to the 1930s. Over time, the museum has grown to include other types of memorabilia and exhibits, including old cars and military uniforms. The best of the planes are kept in flying condition and still take to the air every year for special displays. That's no small achievement, considering the fact that some of them are 100 years old. In keeping with Maloney's wishes, the museum never turns a plane down. So if you happen to have an old plane you're trying to get rid of, give them a call. Our next plane site is one of a far more somber nature. It's the remnants of the infamous Water Rock Knob plane disaster near Sylva, North Carolina. For nearly half a century, the wreck has lain near the Smoky Mountains. When this Cessna 414A crashed into the ground in 1983, it was carrying 2 people. Neither of them made it out alive. The debris and flight logs were forensically examined, but no conclusions were reached. Bad weather, an inexperienced pilot, and simple human errors are all thought to have played a role in the fatal event. The plane's engines were retrieved, but the fuselage's twisted steel was abandoned on the mountainside. Today it serves as a marker for hikers, with some making the difficult climb up the mountainside solely to witness the wreckage. We're not so sure that's a good idea, though, because a combination of steep slopes, challenging terrain, and unmarked side routes has resulted in some people getting hurt while trying to get here. Perhaps this is one plane wreck that should be left alone to gather rust. Willemstad in Curacao is unofficially known as the casino licensing capital of the world. It's also known for being the place where you'll find the wreckage of Air Aruba P4YSA. Nobody in Curacao appears to be 100% certain about how this wreck came to be here. It's missing both of its wings and twin props, and rumor has it that they were deliberately stripped away because the plane was due to be turned into the restaurant. That theory seems to be supported by the presence of a brick and adobe structure on its starboard side, which was to house the restaurant's kitchen. There are no records to serve as evidence of this plan, but that's not unusual in Curacao. This class of plane, known as the NAMC YS-11 and built by the Nihon Aircraft Manufacturing Company of Japan between 1962 and 1974, is known for mechanical failures. 20 of the 182 that were built were involved in hull loss accidents, so it's just as possible that this wreck was yet another example of an NAMC YS-11 falling out of the sky. There would already be something sinister and foreboding looking about Solheimasandur Beach in Iceland, even if there wasn't a plane wreck on it. The weather is cold, the sand is black, and the sky always seems to be gray. If anything, the shattered remains of the U.S. Navy DC-3 on the beach are just doing their best to fit in with the general theme. The huge plane crash-landed on the beach in 1973, thankfully without anybody aboard suffering lasting damage. That didn't stop the pilot from catching the blame for the incident, though. As it appeared, he'd allowed his plane to run out of fuel. The plane was already on the verge of retirement when it went down. So, rather than a salvage attempt being mounted, it was immediately written off and abandoned. It's said to have spent most of the next 2 decades in one piece, until a local farmer came along one day in the 1990s, cut out the entire tail section, and either sold it or used it for scrap metal. Surprisingly, though, the engines are still attached, and the cabin is still pretty much the way it was when the crew walked away almost 50 years ago. The remains of what history records as the worst military aviation accident in the history of Canada can be found at Saint-Donat-de-Montcalm, Quebec. It's known to locals by the plain and simple name of the Liberator III crash site, which is a fair description of both the plane and what you can expect to see if you were to go there. The Liberator III plane crashed into the top of Black Mountain during what should have been a routine flight in October 1943. None of the 24 people aboard the plane survived the incident, and the wreck wasn't found for more than 2 years, despite intense search and rescue operations. Nobody knows what caused the crash, but it's likely to have been down to a combination of human error and bad weather. The height of Black Mountain had been recorded incorrectly on the map used by the pilot, and heavy rain may have prevented the pilot from seeing the top of the mountain until it was too late to get out of its way. The site has been afforded protected status by the Canadian government and contains a memorial to all those who lost their lives here. The wreckage of the Pegasus in Antarctica was once so famous that the nearby airfield was named after it. Although it's been so well preserved by the ice that it looks like it crash-landed there yesterday, the C-121 Lockheed Constellation plane known as Pegasus has been half buried in the snow since October 8, 1970. The plane and her pilots were caught in a vicious storm above the airfield that day, with a blizzard of snow reducing visibility down to zero and wind so strong that it was ripping away scraps of the outer shell. It didn't stand a chance. Pegasus crash-landed on the short runway and then slid across the ice until it struck a thick pile of snow, where it came to a halt. All 80 passengers somehow survived. The plane wasn't so lucky. It was beyond salvage, and so has become something of a landmark in the area. Visitors to McMurdo Station like to walk up to the plane, dusting off the layers of snow that fall on top of it for long enough to take a few photos, or even write their name on the body, so other people can see who's been before them. The Royal Canadian Air Force went to great lengths to ensure that this consolidated Canso bomber would never be of any use to anyone after it crash-landed on Vancouver Island in February 1945. The plane had only just left base in Tofino, piled high with supplies, including 1,000 pounds of explosives, when the portside engine failed. That was terrifying for everyone on board. The plane carried 12 people, almost 3,000 liters of aviation fuel, and 4 depth charges weighing over 250 pounds each. Pilot Ronnie J. Scholl tried to bring the plane back to the airfield, but that involved a 180-degree turn that skimmed the plane across treetops, creating the very real risk of crashing into a hillside. Panicking, Scholl eventually brought the plane down in the forest of Radar Hill. The crash landing caused a fire, but Scholl and his whole crew were rescued. Not long after the rescue mission, the RCAF came back to the site, stripped away all the guns and radios, and then detonated the depth charges. The scars of those detonations can still clearly be seen in the wreck itself and the landscape around it. Why they chose to further damage a plane that was already likely beyond use is unknown. Out in the Saudi Arabian desert, you'll find an old PBY-5A Catalina, riddled with bullet holes it suffered while protecting its owners from a savage assault, and it's been there for more than 4 decades. The plane was once the property of Thomas Kendall, an American businessman who acquired it from the U.S. Navy. In 1960, Kendall had his purchase converted into a flying yacht, and then went on a pleasure trip around the world with his family. They landed in the Strait of Tirana on March 22, 1960, and anchored the Catalina before heading further inland to stay at a hotel. The following day, they were attacked by gunmen. They fled to their plane and tried to take off, but in their panic, they ran aground onto a coral reef. As they sheltered inside the Catalina, it was hit by bullets 300 times, but miraculously avoided bursting into flames, even when the fuel tanks were hit. Eventually, they were captured and interrogated by the Saudi government for unclear purposes, but were set free after a complaint from the U.S. Embassy. The Catalina couldn't be saved and is still there now. The Soviet Union was briefly obsessed with the idea of manufacturing an ekranoplane, a plane that could land on the sea as well as on land. The most spectacular attempt at creating such a plane was the Berev VA14. It was the brainchild of legendary Italian designer Robert Bartini. Making a plane that would be able to take off on land or on the water as easily as it could on a runway was only part of Bartini's brief, though. What the military really wanted was a plane that could fly low enough to take out enemy submarines, but also high enough to do battle in the sky. Bartini's design was capable of taking off and landing from the land without any issues, but making it work the same way on the water proved to be more problematic. The 1972 prototype had pontoons that were supposed to make water landings easy, but they were too rigid and weren't up to the task. Bartini passed away in 1974 before he could make a second prototype, and the Berev VA14 was abandoned. It's now a curious exhibit at the Soviet Central Air Force Museum.
Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!